This is a story of money, power, greed, and corruption. The money is our money. It's severance tax money and it's royalties. Severance taxes and royalties from oil and gas production are our shared claim on the mineral wealth of Louisiana. The power belongs to the oil and gas industry. They've used that power and their influence inside the General Administration to manipulate the regulatory process and to limit the state's ability to audit as much as 17% of the general fund. The greed also belongs to the oil and gas industry. Over the past 7 years, despite collecting $2.4 billion in severance tax exemptions, the industry has used their influence to game the severance tax exemption system, to waive fines and penalties, and to shift responsibility for auditing severance taxes out of the Department of Revenue and into the Department of Natural Resources. The corruption in this story stems from the capture of the Department of Natural Resources by the oil and gas industry. As a result of that capture, policy choices made by the agency favor the industry over the public interest consistently in a string of decisions that stretch back more than 7 years. This is a scandal that's been hiding in plain sight. The information contained in this report are found in reports from the Louisiana Legislative Auditor, the Louisiana Department of Revenue, and the records of the Louisiana Legislature. What they suggest is that the fiscal crisis that threatens to wreck our state right now is directly linked to the power, greed, and corruption at the heart of this story. This story is looting Louisiana. When people say the oil and gas industry built Louisiana, they're not exaggerating. Our state's vast mineral wealth built our colleges, our hospitals, when we had them, roads, and our bridges. They funded our parks, our stadiums, and our flood protection. But the oil and gas industry did not do that out of the kindness of their hearts. They paid for those things through severance taxes and through royalties owed the state for oil and gas produced from state-owned lands and water bottoms. Severance taxes are the constitutional expression of the commons, a small but important public claim on the mineral wealth of our state. We've had a severance tax since 1910. Severance tax revenue is the basis of the oil and gas industry's feel-good story in Louisiana. Severance tax revenue built this state, but it was always our money. Jan Moeller is the director of the Louisiana Budget Project. Moeller says that while state government is less dependent on oil and gas revenue now than it once was, severance taxes and royalty payments are still essential components of the state's general fund financing.
Well, they play a significant role in the state budget, but not as significant as they once did. If you go back to the mid-'80s, about 40% of Louisiana's budget was tied to oil and gas revenues. Today, that's around 15 to 17, 18%, depending on the year and the activity in the oil field. So we're much less dependent on oil and gas revenue than we once were, but it's still a key part of the state general fund. And when those revenues don't come in as expected, or when those revenues decrease, that means the state either has to make up the revenue somewhere else or else find more ways to cut. And what we've been doing in recent years is mostly cutting the budget, cutting critical services that people depend on, in part because, like you said, revenues have not been coming in at the rate we expected.
Karen LeBlanc is the Performance Audit Director for the Louisiana Legislative Auditor. She said that it was the key role of severance tax and royalty revenue in the state general fund that drew her office's attention.
Severance tax, I think, is about 10% of the state general fund every year, and royalties are about 7%, so about 17% of the general
We're talking a significant amount of money.
Right, which is why we focused on, the department's processes for ensuring these are adequate and accurate.
One reason oil and gas revenue has fallen as a percentage of state general fund dollars is that severance tax exemptions have taken a huge bite out of state revenues over the past decade, particularly with the onset of horizontal drilling as a component of hydraulic fracking. Every year since the 1980s, the Louisiana Department of Revenue has published an annual report that tracks just how much tax exemptions cost the state. In it, the department makes clear that tax exemptions are, in fact, a spending of state funds. Here's how LDR explains that in every report. Tax exemptions are tax dollars that are not collected and result in a loss of state tax revenues available for appropriation. In this sense, the fiscal effect of tax exemptions is the same as a direct fund expenditure. Between 2008 and 2014, according to the tax exemption budget, the state of Louisiana paid oil and gas companies more than $2.4 billion in severance tax exemptions. Those checks went out at the exact same time that our legislature cut funding for programs like aid to families of children with disabilities, behavioral health programs, home health care, and programs that assisted victims of domestic violence. During that same time, state funding for higher education was also cut by more than $700 million, as the tuition and fees paid by those attending technical colleges, community colleges, and state universities were jacked up to cover the difference. Severance tax exemptions are massive transfers of public wealth, our shared claim on the mineral wealth of this state, into the coffers of oil and gas companies and landowners. The severance tax exemption on horizontal drilling was enacted in 1994. It was an incentive for an experimental technology. When the Haynesville Trend rocketed into production in the first decade of this century, it did so on wells drilled using horizontal drilling. At its peak, it became the most productive shale gas field in the country. By all accounts, horizontal drilling was no longer an experimental technology. Yet the oil and gas industry resisted attempts to repeal the exemption in 2011. As a result, the state has lost hundreds of millions of dollars in severance taxes to the companies that profited from the mineral wealth and the Haynesville Trend. Exempting severance taxes negates the public claim on that mineral wealth and undermines our ability to invest in ourselves as a state. The $2.4 billion in severance tax exemptions we gave the oil and gas companies between 2008 and 2014 was money that did not go to build schools, roads, bridges, or provide health care. Jan Moeller explains that severance taxes and royalty payments represent public resources.
I think it's important to remember that even if whether this is on public lands or private lands, these resources were here long before any of us got here, and they are a public resource that somebody is extracting, and so the public deserves to get some gain from that, because once you've taken it out of the ground, you can't put it back. So that's why we have severance and taxes and royalties. That's why it's important to collect them, because these are public resources. These are everybody's resources. Even if it's on private land or public land, the public has a stake in this.
Another reason that oil and gas revenue has fallen as a percentage of state revenue is that, as in the case of the Department of Revenue, state agencies charged with collecting those revenues have been blocked when they aggressively sought to ensure that the state has been getting paid what it was owed. Or, as in the case of the Department of Natural Resources, they were all too willing to accept what the industry said it was willing to pay. That is the inescapable conclusion that emerges from the performance audits conducted by the Louisiana Legislative Auditor since 2010. During a time of recurring revenue shortfalls, the auditor found that the Department of Natural Resources Office of Mineral Resources was making minimal effort to ensure that royalty payments made by the industry were accurate. Karen LeBlanc is the Director of Performance Audit Services for the Louisiana Legislative Auditor. The purpose of performance audits is to determine how state agencies and departments are handling the responsibilities they have been given.
Performance audit can be many different things. Generally, it's measuring a program against what they're supposed to be doing. And if you find that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, then you make recommendations for them to improve. Performance audits can look at any number of programs. They can be informational in nature, or they can be more of a typical audit, which has findings, as we say, and then recommendations to address those findings.
In the spring of 2010, the Legislative Auditor conducted a performance audit of the Department of Natural Resources' handling of mineral royalty audits. The state of Louisiana is the largest landowner in the state, and there are more than 1,800 mineral leases in place on state-owned lands and water bottoms across Louisiana. Oil and gas royalty revenues account for about 7% of the general fund budget. That 2010 performance audit found that DNR's Office of Mineral Resources was not using all the data at its disposal in order to determine if royalty payments being made to the state were accurate.
The reporting data for royalties goes to the Department of Natural Resources, the Office of Mineral Resources. But the Office of Conservation also gets production data every month from oil and gas companies, but OMR is the one who gets the royalty report from the production data. The severance tax reporting data goes directly to the Louisiana Department of Revenue. So one of the things we recommended is everyone's getting these different numbers, and it's all self-reported from oil and gas companies. So work together to make sure that what you have reported for the production for a month matches what DNR has for the production for a month. And that would be a good kind of check and balances to make sure everybody's paying what they're supposed to be.
That 2010 report also found that it had been 10 years since DNR and the Office of Mineral Resources had conducted a volume audit to verify the accuracy of royalty payments.
Well, it's really a volume audit. It's a volume desk audit, but it's more of an automated process. And they don't have a lot of staff there, and actually the number of audits they've conducted has gone down. So volume audits are something that are used by other states as kind of an efficient way to audit, and that basically compares what OMR is getting in royalty production amounts to what Office of Conservation is getting in production amounts, and do some sort of automated testing to make sure they equal each other every month.
Even with those audits, the state would not be sure if royalty payments were accurate because the oil and gas industry self-reports the production totals. Without the audits, the state is essentially taking the industry at its word.
It's all self-reporting. Unfortunately, oil and gas wells do not report production for most of the wells by well. DNR requires that they report on a lease unit well basis, which is a LU code. So a lot of times they'll report one lease can contain multiple wells. So it's really impossible to tell how much is coming from that one well. A lot of other states require that wells report production by well, but we don't.
In response to the legislative auditor's royalty performance audit findings, on June 24, 2010, DNR announced that as part of the Streamlining Commission's recommendation, OMR will take over LDR's severance tax field audit program, and the two audits will be integrated beginning July 1st, 2010. It was a move that would prove costly to the state. In September of 2013, the legislative auditor released a follow-up performance audit on royalty collections. The auditors were dismayed to find that the revenue produced by OMR's audits had fallen below the levels reported in 2010. At a time when the state's pattern of recurring revenue shortfalls had been well established, DNR's Office of Mineral Resources had actually reduced the level of auditing on royalty payments.
The number of audits has decreased. Right. Even with royalties, it decreased, I think. 23% of royalties were audited in the first year in 2008, and that went down to 13% in 2013. And the amount they identified went from $8 million to $3 million. So, I mean, the more audits they can do, the more they can identify. It's just that as of lately, they've done fewer and fewer.
The auditor also found that the State Mineral and Energy Board had waived 45% of the $12.8 million in penalties that were assessed against companies by OMR for late payment of royalties. Karen LeBlanc of the Legislative Auditor's Office said that the Mineral and Energy Board could not provide an explanation of what method it was using to determine which fines were waived and which ones stuck.
We tried to figure out what the reasons were for these waived penalties, but they didn't keep track of those. So, I mean, that's another kind of source of revenue that we could probably use.
Neither the Office of Mineral Resources nor the State Mineral and Energy Board seemed at all concerned about the fiscal impact their indifference to generating revenue had on programs that Louisiana residents depended on. The legislative auditor conducted an audit on severance tax collection procedures in the Louisiana Department of Revenue in 2013. But because severance tax audit functions have been transferred to DNR in 2010, auditors had to return to the Office of Mineral Resources close on the heels of the second royalty collections audit. In this audit, the legislative auditor found that oil and gas industry complaints about the Department of Revenue's use of the GenTax software, which identified possible non-payers of severance tax, led first to LDR shutting off the software, and second to audit power being transferred to DNR. Karen LeBlanc of the Legislative Auditor's Office explained that GenTax severance component was turned off in response to industry complaints.
Because it was producing erroneous billings or something, so they turned off this automated feature in GenTax for a couple of years, I think, and that was one of the ways they identified people who weren't filing. So who knows what happened during that time. Right. I think since that time they have turned it back on. I think in December 2013 they said they were turning that back on, that automated feature.
After succeeding in shutting down the Gentax software, the industry scored another win when the Department of Natural Resources won a tug-of-war with the Department of Revenue over which department would have audit authority over severance taxes. That was the decision DNR first announced in response to the 2010 royalty audit report. The closer coordination with LDR on royalty and severance tax audits was actually removal of audit authority from the state's chief tax collector and handing it to the department that had a notoriously close relationship to the oil and gas industry. LeBlanc said that this change was not what the legislative auditor had in mind when it urged closer cooperation between the two departments.
We didn't expressly recommend that. We just wanted there to be more coordination between the two and communication. Not sure why it was decided to go over there. I mean, in some ways it makes sense to combine them, but I think when it was shifted over there, what happened was the amount of audits that were conducted dropped significantly. I think they, once it moved to DNR, I'm trying to think what the numbers are, it dropped 99%. From
Right.
26 million identified to only 40,000 identified.
The report attributes a sharp drop to a difference in methodology used by DNR. Put simply, for 3 years, DNR's Office of Mineral Resources limited its severance tax audits only to those companies operating on state-owned lands, a very small percentage of total oil and gas operations in Louisiana. LeBlanc explained DNR's approach.
And part of the reason they gave for that was they only did audits of severance taxes if that same company had state-owned leases or had paid royalties as well. So they combined the two. But there's tons of oil and gas companies that aren't on state. Yeah, right. So that severely limited who they looked at.
The scale of oil and gas production not audited as a result of that shift was staggering. DNR's field audits ignored oil and gas production on private lands, which comprised 98.1% of all oil and gas leases in Louisiana. Losing out on potentially hundreds of millions of dollars during tight fiscal times put more pressure on already strained state budgets. But this apparent loss to the state was a big win for the industry. How big? Well, for starters, the industry complaints about severance tax audits, which had produced the shutdown of the Department of Revenue's Gentax software, disappeared completely. And why not? Severance tax audits were limited to companies operating on state leases. The rest of the industry, operating on the 98% of leases on private lands, was left to pay what it wanted for 3 years. Jan Moeller of the Louisiana Budget Project said that for those 3 years when severance tax audit authority was transferred to DNR, the department had control of one key component of the state's general fund.
I mean, if you look at what funds state government, I mean, there's a lot of revenue sources that come in, but it's basically income taxes, sales taxes, and mineral revenues. Those are the three major legs of the stool that state government simply can't operate without.
David Brown is a Baton Rouge attorney with extensive experience in regulatory fights with state agencies. He says that the shifting of severance tax audit authority from the Department of Revenue to DNR raises red flags.
It again is troublesome. It's problematic because, you know, if one agency is doing its job well, and that's upsetting to the regulated entities, they can make noise and have it moved to someone else that they have a more cozy relationship with or expect to get a better deal from, and you know it starts to feel like there's something, you know, something corrupt or something afoul is taking place.
For the 3-year period that DNR's Office of Mineral Resources had responsibility for severance tax audits, the industry essentially operated under an honor system. Karen LeBlanc said that self-reporting by the oil and gas industry is the rule in Louisiana, not the exception.
I would say for the most part it's always been an honor system in terms of the production amounts, because it's really almost impossible to verify that. Even the market price, which is used in the calculation, is self-reported, and we recommended that they go back and find some way to verify that as well.
During the time that DNR had severance tax audit authority, the Haynesville Trend emerged as the most productive shale gas field in the country. Even though the severance tax exemption on horizontal drilling meant that the state was denied severance tax revenue for much of that play, companies still managed to game the tax exemption system at taxpayer expense. Karen LeBlanc, the Legislative Auditor's Office, explains.
Once they start producing, they go ahead and pay the severance tax. Until they get their exemption approved by the department. So once it's approved, then they could get their refund of the taxes that they paid during the time they started producing to when they got their exemption approved. But they also get interest upon that amount. So they got about $23 million in interest from that due to that time lag, in addition to the exemption.
In addition, the auditor found that the Department of Revenue overpaid severance tax exemption refunds by $12.9 million between July 2010 and May 2012. Those severance tax overpayments could have been due to the Gentax software being shut down during the period covered by the severance tax audit. The decline in audit revenue, the interest paid to companies gaming the severance tax exemption process, the overpayment of severance tax exemption refunds, the decision by the State Mineral Board to waive 45% of the fines for late payment of royalties combined to benefit the industry at taxpayer expense to the tune of $68 million. These gifts to the oil and gas industry were made at a time when the industry was already receiving $2.4 billion in tax exemptions, and at a time when every dollar the state did not collect translated into a cut to programs that Louisiana residents depended on. The legislative auditor also pointed out that hiring additional auditors within DNR and LDR would produce a great return on the state's investment.
I think in 2010 we found that for the royalty side for DNR, we found that an auditor could generate about $1.2 million each year. So I think we recommended, given the return on investment, that DNR really should hire more auditors.
Oil and gas companies control all of the information used in the severance tax and royalty payment processes. The industry has used this power to its advantage and to the state's detriment. Vigilant auditing can close that information gap. The Office of Mineral Resources has shown little interest in that kind of work. DNR's abdication of its oversight role on royalty revenue has had an outsized impact on Louisiana because of the role that revenue plays in state finances. When added to the 3-year period when DNR failed to perform severance tax audits, the agency has likely cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 7 years. Patrick Corregis is the spokesman for the Department of Natural Resources and the Office of Conservation. He says suggestions of corruption at DNR mistake the state's history for the department's reality.
Everybody knows Louisiana's got a history, and there's some things that weren't done the way they should have been. But that ain't this day. It's something I've run into frustration because I've seen how hard people in DNR, DEQ, the different regulatory agencies, how hard they worked to get it done right, and almost immediately dismissed. You're a captured agency, I believe is the phrase, or whatever that is. Really, because I live in a trailer. I'm not getting real rich, and industry spends a lot of time being mad at us.
If industry is in fact angry at DNR and other regulatory agencies, it says more about how insistent they are at having their way in the face of even the most timid efforts to honor the public interest. Not all forms of corruption involve payoffs. There are more subtle forms. One of those is regulatory capture. DNR's relationship with the oil and gas industry is a clear example of regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a form of political corruption that occurs when an agency created to act in the public interest advances instead the special concerns of the industry it was charged to regulate. In DNR's case, the proof is in the policy choices. When confronted with choices between favoring industry's interest or the public interest, DNR, its various offices and boards, have consistently chosen to serve the interests of the oil and gas industry instead of the public interest. All of this was taking place when the state was operating within tight fiscal constraints. Budget cuts were devastating programs ranging from aid to families of children with disabilities, home health programs for the elderly and disabled, programs for victims of domestic violence, and others. State support for higher education in Louisiana was cut faster and deeper than in any other state in the country. Yet the oil and gas industry got its $2.4 billion in severance tax exemptions and continued to seek and find ways to make money off the state during tight budgetary times. Jan Moeller of the Louisiana Budget Project explains the implications of all this.
We have a revenue problem in this state. There are hundreds of bills that have been filed for this upcoming session that raise taxes in some way, shape, or form on average Louisiana families. And before we ask those families to pay more, and they may have to pay more to make up this shortfall, it is critical that we collect what we are owed already, that we enforce the laws that are already on the books. That's why this is important.
In the 2014 legislative session, Senator Rick Gallo of Ruston and Representative Joe Harrison of Gray introduced concurrent resolutions to order LDR, DNR, and the legislative auditor to agree upon a means to conduct a thorough audit of oil and gas production, severance taxes, and royalty payments. Gallo's resolution passed the Senate by a vote of 35-0. But by the time the resolution reached the House floor in early June, the oil and gas industry and the General Administration recognized the threat the audit posed, so they joined up to kill it. The resolution had to be killed to keep the secret. In the midst of a prolonged and deepening fiscal crisis, the General Administration and the industry did not want legislators and the public to question whether severance taxes and royalties paid to the state were accurately calculated. The Department of Natural Resources betrayed the trust of the people of this state. It failed its fiduciary responsibility twice. First as a collector of royalty payments, and again during its time as chief auditor of severance taxes. It has repeatedly put the needs of the industry above the needs of the people of this state. $2.4 billion in severance tax exemption payments were not enough for the oil and gas industry. Its greed is so great that in a time of fiscal constraints on state government, it went out of its way to cheat the state out of still more money. It used its power and influence in the Department of Natural Resources and its ties to the General Administration to do so. By these acts, the oil and gas industry has shown itself to be unworthy of the trust we have placed in it. For looting Louisiana in our time of fiscal need, the oil and gas industry should be stripped of its severance tax exemptions. Under the Louisiana Constitution, we are entitled to the full benefits of this state's mineral wealth.